is the car itself. And today we're looking at this 1969 Ford Talladega, and the car is named after the superspeedway that was made popular in NASCAR, the Talladega Motor Speedway. And in fact, this car was actually debuted at that speedway in 1969. And although it might look like a regular Ford Torino, the Talladega is very different and very unique. It's basically built off the Torino platform, but there was a handful of modifications done to the Talladega to improve the car's aerodynamics. The NASCAR rulebook dictated that the cars on the speedway had to have the same DNA as the cars that you could buy at your local dealership. So, to make a car legal for competition, the factory had to make a certain number of street versions. And this one is one of the 500 required 69 Torino Talladegas. At this point in the history of NASCAR, they were really starting to learn about the advantages of making the cars slipperier in the wind. They would go faster, they would use less fuel, they would be able to run longer between refuelings. So, any kind of aerodynamic advantage was really considered and implemented in the late 60s. In fact, that time period is sometimes referred to as the Aero Wars, because in '69 we saw things like the Charger 500 and this Talladega and the Mercury Cyclone spoiler. And by 1970 we saw the Hemi wing cars and the Daytonas and the Superbirds, which really were using aerodynamics as much as possible. But in the case of all these cars, to be legal to compete in NASCAR, there had to be a street-going version that resembled the race car. Now, I don't know legally how many changes they could make to deviate from the race version, but when we look at this Talladega, we can see that a lot of things were done to make this car closely resemble the race version. It might look like a regular Torino, but the Talladega is hiding some obvious and subtle differences. The big thing is the nose. The nose has been extended about 6 inches longer than a stock Torino, and they moved the headlights and the grille to the front of the car because on the regular Torino, that area would catch air and that wasn't good for aerodynamics. So this kind of smooths it out. A subtle difference is that the bumper on the front of this car is actually the same one you find on the back, which is pretty weird. I don't know of any other car that you can interchange the front and rear bumpers. Not only did they make it longer, they made the nose kind of come to a point more. On the stock Torino, if you look down from the top, the opening of the grille and the bumper shape resembled a W. But on this car, it's basically flat straight across with a very subtle peak in the middle, forming kind of a point at the front of the car. Now, if you tried to find a part number on a Talladega fender, you're not going to find one because every one of these cars, and they ended up making about 750 of them, but every one of them had these hand-fabricated extensions that were built by Ford to lengthen the front of the car. Of course, that header panel's also been made longer. So just in the front of the car, they went a long way to improve the aerodynamics. These Talladegas were only available in 3 colors, Wimbledon white, the royal maroon like we see here, or presidential blue, but they all had a satin black hood. And the hood looks kind of racy with the menacing satin black, but it also had the effect of minimizing glare when the sun shone down on race day. It kept the sun out of the eyes of the drivers. Now, Ford took advantage of the rule book a little bit when they redesigned the rocker panels on this car. NASCAR had a special gauge to dictate the ride height, and they measured from the bottom of the rocker panel to the ground, and if a car was too low, it wouldn't be legal to race. So what Ford did is they kind of squeezed that rocker panel to elevate the bottom of the pinch weld, so they could lower the car an extra inch to be legal without changing any of the rest of the car. So it was kind of a neat little trick which made for a faster race car. On the back of the car, we see a blacked out tail panel, and we also see another tight-fitting rear bumper. The rear suspension was different on these cars. It had a staggered shock absorber arrangement, which was unusual for this platform and only done for the Talladega. And interestingly, it had a Ford 9-inch rear axle with 31 spline axles and a 325-to-1 rear gear ratio, but it did not have a locking differential. It had an open diff for all the cars that were sold on the street. When you got behind the wheel of a Talladega, you sat down on a bench seat with a column shifter, which really doesn't seem to be very racy, but every one of these cars was built with that bench seat and the column shift. There were really no options to speak of, but these cars did receive an AM radio from the factory. And when you look around the cockpit, you'll see some Talladega badging on the inside of the car to let you know that even though it was a bench seat column shift car, it still had racing heritage. A few more unique items on a Talladega under the hood are the hood latch. They cut the original latch here and added this arm so they could put a cable release on it. After all, you couldn't reach in here with your fingers and pull the release because of the new grille style. You'll also notice the leading edge of the hood has holes where the trim went on the stock short-nose Torino, but on this car, now we've got an extension here which doesn't allow for the trim to fit when you close the hood. Now, the race cars on the NASCAR tracks were powered by 427 side-oiler engines and eventually the Boss 429 V8, but for the street, it's a little more subtle. These are powered by 428 Cobra Jet engines. And this is a non-Ram Air version like you saw in the Mustang, but it still made 335 horsepower at 5,200 RPM, which was, you know, like all the muscle cars, rumored to be rated a little bit less than its actual output. It was a 10.6-to-1 compression ratio engine, had lots of good parts inside. Another unique feature is the engine oil cooler and power steering cooler, both Cobra Jet pieces mounted behind the grille with the high pressure lines that go back to the side of the engine. This particular car is in really, really amazing condition. It's been restored. This is the 76th car built of the 750. It's one of 258 made in the color scheme, and it was sold new in May of 1969 at Pueblo Ford in Tucson, Arizona. And this particular car was built on January 24th of 1969 at the Atlanta Ford manufacturing plant. So the history is very, very well known on this particular car, and although it might not be as recognizable as, say, a Dodge Daytona Hemi wing car, it certainly has a strong piece of NASCAR history, as these things proved to be very successful in the 1969 NASCAR season. We think it's pretty cool that Ford made a version of their NASCAR for the street that was significantly different than the regular Torino. I don't know if today's auto manufacturers made a special race car version for the street. Would you buy one?